Hello, everyone. Tonight, we dive into a case that has haunted a small town on the southern border of the United States for over 3 decades. It's a case that left questions unanswered, families torn apart, and a mystery that still lingers in the dark corners of history. We are talking about the disappearance of Lucas Alvarez, a young boy, just 7 years old, who vanished one summer evening in 1987, without a trace. If you like true crime stories based on real-life disappearances and unsolved cases, subscribe now, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. Invite viewers to share their local time and locations. The evening of Lucas's disappearance was like any other in the quiet town of San Isidro. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Lucas had been playing in his front yard, kicking a ball against the house, laughing as he chased it. His mother, Maria, had stepped inside briefly to prepare dinner. The house smelled of garlic and onions, a familiar scent of comfort and home. It was a moment she would later replay in her mind over and over again, unable to understand how things had gone so wrong so quickly. When Maria returned to the front door, her heart sank. Lucas was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no cries for help, just the sudden, eerie silence that fell over the street. She called out his name, ran up and down the block, asking neighbors if they had seen him, but no one had. A search was immediately launched, but nothing could be found. The police scoured the area, interviewed witnesses, and combed through the dense forest at the edge of town. But there were no clues. It was as if Lucas had simply vanished into thin air. The disappearance of Lucas Alvarez became a headline in local newspapers. Parents in San Isidro were frightened, but there was little anyone could do. The police were baffled. A missing child case that seemed to offer no leads, no ransom demands, no suspicious behavior. It was the beginning of a cold case, one that would never be solved, at least not by the people who had searched for him. Maria never gave up hope. She spent the years after Lucas's disappearance keeping the door open at night, as if he might walk through it at any moment. Her grief consumed her, but she clung to the possibility that one day her son would come home. As the years passed, the case grew colder, and eventually, people stopped asking about it. The town moved on, but Maria never did. And then, 30 years later, the truth began to surface. It started with an old box, a box filled with forgotten memories. The box was found in 2022, hidden in the attic of the Alvarez family home, just after Maria's death. Her daughter, Isabel, was left with the task of sorting through her mother's belongings, a job she had never anticipated, and one that filled her with a strange mix of dread and curiosity. As Isabel opened the box, the faint smell of old paper and dust filled the air. It was a box that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime, one full of memories, forgotten dreams, and unanswered questions. Among the crumbling letters and yellowed photographs, something caught Isabel's eye. At the bottom of the box, there was a single photograph. The image was faded, its edges curled with age. But there was no mistaking the young boy in the picture. It was Lucas. But this was no ordinary photo. Isabel's fingers trembled as she picked it up, gazing at the image of her brother, now a young boy of about 8 or 9. He was standing next to a woman Isabel did not recognize, in front of a building that looked foreign, an image of a city skyline that was far from the quiet town of San Isidro. The woman in the photograph had an air of authority about her, her posture rigid, her eyes cold and calculating. The background of the photograph seemed to be from a different time, taken in the early 1990s, long after Lucas had disappeared in 1987. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest. The photograph made no sense. It was taken years after Lucas had vanished, in a place far from their hometown. What was he doing there? Who was this woman? And why hadn't anyone mentioned this photograph before? Confused and disturbed, Isabel turned to the back of the photo, where something was written in barely legible handwriting: Luke with Maria Garcia, 1993, Paris. The name Maria Garcia meant nothing to Isabel, but the city Paris sent a chill down her spine. Paris was a long way from San Isidro, and it was a place associated with wealth, power, and, as Isabel would soon discover, crime. Unable to contain her growing sense of urgency, Isabel decided to show the photograph to the local authorities. She approached the police department, hoping for an answer, but what she received instead was a cold, indifferent reaction. The case of Lucas Alvarez had long been considered unsolved, forgotten by many, and dismissed as a tragic, random event. But this photograph, this eerie, haunting photograph, seemed to open up a door that had been locked for decades. Isabel didn't know what to expect, but she knew she couldn't let it go. There was something deeply wrong with the photo, something that suggested Lucas hadn't just wandered off or gotten lost. The more Isabel thought about it, the more she realized that the photograph could be a key to unlocking a truth that had been buried for years. It was time to dig deeper. She began her own investigation. The name Maria Garcia kept appearing in her mind. She ran the name through local databases, searched online for any references, but the results were sparse. It wasn't until Isabel reached out to an old retired detective named Marco Hernandez that things began to move forward. Marco had worked on Lucas's case back in 1987. He had been one of the last to investigate, but after weeks of dead ends and lack of evidence, he too had given up on the case. When Isabel showed Marco the photograph, his reaction was immediate. His eyes widened, and his hands shook slightly as he examined it. "I remember Maria Garcia," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's involved in something much darker than we ever knew." Marco revealed to Isabel that Maria Garcia was not just a random name. She was known in certain circles as a figure tied to cross-border child trafficking. It wasn't just rumors or whispers. There were documents and testimonies linking her to an international network that operated out of Europe. Garcia was a key player in a network that abducted children from the United States and sold them to wealthy families in foreign countries. The revelation was staggering. It meant that Lucas hadn't been lost. He hadn't run away. He had been taken by someone with the resources to hide him far from home. With this new information, Isabel and Marco set out on a journey that would take them far beyond the borders of their small town. They would soon find themselves confronting a dark world of criminal organizations, powerful people, and a mystery that stretched across continents. But Isabel knew one thing for certain: her brother was still out there, and she would stop at nothing to find him. The sun had barely risen over the small town of San Isidro when Isabel and Marco sat down together in a dimly lit diner, a pot of coffee between them. Their conversation hushed. The news about Maria Garcia was both unsettling and confusing, but there was no turning back now. Isabel had already made up her mind she would follow the trail, no matter where it led. For years, she had lived with the gnawing feeling of something unfinished, the eerie silence that hung over the case. But now, with the photograph as their starting point, a new determination took root. Marco hadn't worked a case in years. The files he kept from his time with the police department were a relic of the past, faded and yellowed with time. But as he sifted through them, something familiar stirred inside him, a spark that had been extinguished long ago, rekindled by Isabel's resolve. "We need to follow the money," Marco said quietly, tapping his fingers against the coffee cup. "Who was buying these children? And where are they now?" The first step was to track down Maria Garcia. Marco had heard whispers about her operations in the late 80s, but never had enough evidence to take action. She had always operated in the shadows, a figure in the criminal underworld that few knew about, but many feared. The photograph Isabel had found seemed to suggest that Garcia wasn't just a low-level trafficker. She was part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. Marco and Isabel worked tirelessly over the following days, scouring old newspapers, calling in favors from old contacts, and piecing together a fragmented puzzle. They learned that Maria Garcia had once been involved in a high-profile case in the early 1990s, one that had been quickly swept under the rug by powerful people. Isabel's search led her to a single, chilling fact: Maria Garcia was linked to a network of child traffickers who had been operating in the United States for years, sending children to wealthy families across Europe and even the Middle East. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Lucas had been one of the victims in a far-reaching international operation. Maria Garcia's role in this web of deceit was undeniable, and Isabel was determined to bring her to justice. But there was a problem. Garcia had disappeared years ago, leaving behind no trace. No one knew where she was or what happened to her after she was last seen in Paris. The only thing Isabel had was the photograph. With the trail growing colder by the minute, Marco suggested they head to Paris. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only lead they had left. The next morning, they boarded a plane, each consumed by the same haunting thought. What if they were too late? Arriving in Paris, the city felt different in the early spring air. The streets, bustling with tourists and locals alike, held an unsettling quiet for Isabel and Marco. As they walked through the city, the towering spires of the Notre Dame loomed overhead, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, as if the city itself was hiding secrets beneath its polished surface. Their first stop was a local investigator who had once worked with the French authorities to look into the trafficking ring that had flourished in the early 1990s. He had long since retired, but Isabel hoped that he might still have some information that could point them in the right direction. The investigator, a man named Jean-Paul, was an aging former detective with a sharp mind and a deep understanding of the criminal underworld. When he saw the photograph Isabel showed him, his eyes narrowed. He took a long drag from his cigarette and placed the photo on the table between them. "I've seen this woman before," Jean-Paul said slowly, his voice gravelly. "Maria Garcia. She was involved with a network that brought children into the country, but we couldn't prove it. She always had her connections. Too powerful to touch." Isabel's stomach dropped. Maria Garcia had been here, in Paris, with Lucas. But why the photograph was proof that Lucas had been far from home. But why had he been brought here? And who was the woman that had appeared to be so close to him? Jean-Paul pulled out an old dossier from his desk drawer, filled with police reports and photographs. He flipped through it, his fingers pausing on a familiar name, Maria Garcia. It seemed that Maria had connections to some of the wealthiest families in Europe, the kind of families whose influence stretched across borders, making it nearly impossible for the authorities to track their activities. As they dug deeper, they learned that Lucas's adoption had been orchestrated through a series of legal loopholes. The wealthy family that had taken him in had paid a substantial amount of money to ensure that no one would ask questions about where he came from. Lucas had been sold to them as a child, a commodity, and in the eyes of the law, he was just another orphan looking for a home. But Isabel refused to let that be the end of it. She and Marco continued to press the case, slowly unraveling the web of corruption that had kept Lucas hidden for all these years. They discovered that the child trafficking ring was even more extensive than they could have imagined, and its roots reached deep into political and economic circles, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. Isabel and Marco were getting closer, but they knew they were running out of time. Powerful people were beginning to take notice of their investigation, and they weren't pleased. It was clear that they had attracted the wrong kind of attention, and soon, it became evident that the stakes were higher than ever. The more Isabel and Marco uncovered, the darker the world they stepped into became. The trail led them deeper into an intricate web of child trafficking that spanned continents, with connections running through governments, businesses, and powerful families across the globe. They were no longer just two people searching for a missing child. They had become part of a much larger story, one that threatened to unravel the very fabric of society's hidden underbelly. Every lead they followed brought them closer to the heart of this network. The more they learned about Maria Garcia's involvement, the more horrifying it became. She was not a mere trafficker. She was a mastermind, a key player who had managed to stay out of the authorities' reach for years. Her connections were vast, stretching from the streets of Paris to the high-rises of New York City, from the beaches of the Mediterranean to the remote villages of South America. They learned that Lucas was not the only child abducted by Garcia. In fact, there had been dozens of children taken from small towns across the United States and sold into the trafficking network. Some were sold to wealthy families in Europe, while others were shipped off to the Middle East. The children were often kept hidden, their identities erased, their families left in the dark, just like Lucas's family had been. The investigation began to feel like a race against time. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the journey became. Isabel and Marco found themselves up against a powerful, shadowy network that had its hands in nearly every major industry. The authorities, Isabel quickly realized, were either too afraid or too compromised to bring any significant action against the traffickers. One evening, as they sat in their hotel room in Paris, the full weight of the situation hit Isabel. She stared at the photograph of Lucas, the image that had started it all. The boy in the photo was no longer just her brother. He was a symbol of something much larger. Lucas's abduction was not an isolated incident. It was part of a global phenomenon that had destroyed countless lives, and the truth was being kept from the public. "I don't think we're just looking for Lucas anymore," Isabel said, her voice filled with a quiet, steely determination. "We're trying to expose something much bigger than us." Marco nodded, his eyes heavy with the weight of the truth they were uncovering. He had been in the game long enough to know that this kind of conspiracy wasn't just a local issue. It was something much more insidious, something that involved people in high places who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. The stakes were high, and they were now in the crosshairs. Their next move took them to an underground warehouse in the outskirts of Paris, where they hoped to find more information about the trafficking ring. It was a place of shadowy figures and whispered conversations. When they arrived, the air was thick with tension. They had received an anonymous tip about a meeting scheduled that night, one that could provide them with crucial details. Isabel and Marco waited in the darkened shadows of the warehouse, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the cold concrete floor. They could hear the low murmur of voices ahead, people talking in a language they couldn't understand, the clink of metal on metal, the soft shuffle of boots on gravel. It was clear they weren't alone. But just as they prepared to move closer, a familiar voice echoed through the warehouse. It was one that Isabel recognized, the voice of Jean-Paul, the retired investigator. He had led them here, but Isabel hadn't expected him to be involved in this dangerous world. As they stepped out from their hiding place, Isabel's heart skipped a beat. Jean-Paul stood at the center of the room, flanked by two men whose faces were hidden in the shadows. "I never wanted you to get involved, Isabel," Jean-Paul said softly, his eyes meeting hers with an expression that was both regretful and resolute. "But now you know too much, and there are people out there who can't afford for you to walk away." Before Isabel could respond, a harsh voice from behind them interrupted. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward. His face was partially obscured by a mask, but Isabel could see the coldness in his eyes. "Get rid of them," the man said. Now, the tension in the air was palpable. Marco, his instincts kicking in, stepped forward, ready to protect Isabel at all costs. But it was too late. The warehouse was filled with men who had been lying in wait, their expressions hardening as they moved in closer. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, realizing the danger they were in. The truth they were chasing had caught up to them faster than they could have imagined. She and Marco had been walking a razor's edge, but now the consequences of their investigation were becoming all too real. In the chaos that followed, Isabel managed to grab Marco's arm and pull him toward the exit. It was a dangerous, chaotic scramble. Their only goal was to escape the warehouse alive. The sound of boots pounding on the concrete echoed in their ears as they ran, the adrenaline rushing through their veins. They barely managed to slip out the back door, but they knew that the men behind them would stop at nothing to catch up. As they reached the street, panting and out of breath, Isabel couldn't help but wonder how many more people would have to suffer before the truth was fully exposed. The answers were within reach, but the cost of finding them was far greater than she had ever imagined. The next morning, after a restless night spent in hiding, Isabel and Marco stood on the edge of the unknown. The escape from the warehouse had been harrowing, and the faces of those who pursued them haunted Isabel's thoughts. The sinister, masked man, the unknown men in the shadows, each of them seemed to represent something far greater, something far darker than either Isabel or Marco had anticipated. What they were uncovering was no longer just a search for her missing brother. It was a war against a hidden empire built on the exploitation of innocent lives. Now, in Paris, there was no time to waste. They had no choice but to press forward. The photograph had led them to this point, and they couldn't afford to lose their grip on the truth. Lucas's case had become a symbol for something much larger, the international trafficking network that had ensnared not only him, but hundreds of other children. The man from the warehouse, the one who had ordered them to be dealt with, was a part of something much bigger, a web of criminals with resources so vast, so far-reaching, that they had the power to control entire industries. The evidence Isabel and Marco had uncovered pointed to high-profile figures, individuals with so much power that they were untouchable by the law. But Isabel refused to back down. She owed it to Lucas, to herself, and to the countless other children who had vanished without a trace. It was clear now this wasn't just about a missing child. It was about exposing a global trafficking network that had been thriving for decades, hidden in plain sight. Isabel's investigation soon led them to a chilling realization. Maria Garcia, the woman in the photograph with Lucas, had been a central figure in this network. She had connections in both Europe and the United States, and her influence had enabled her to operate with impunity. The people protecting her were not just criminals. They were wealthy elites who had been buying and selling children for years, hiding behind their facades of power and privilege. But even though the investigation was heating up, it was far from straightforward. Every step they took seemed to lead them into even more danger. They had barely escaped the warehouse in Paris, but now they had a new lead, a well-known luxury villa in the south of France, a place where Maria Garcia had allegedly been seen in the company of some of the most influential people in Europe. This was where they hoped to find the answers. Arriving in the French Riviera, the tension in the air felt different. The sparkling blue of the Mediterranean seemed at odds with the dark truth they were chasing. The villa, hidden behind high gates and lush gardens, was surrounded by armed guards and security cameras. The mansion seemed like a fortress, designed not just to protect the wealthy, but to conceal the sinister dealings that took place behind its walls. Isabel and Marco went undercover, posing as potential buyers seeking to acquire rare, valuable art. Their plan was simple: infiltrate the villa, gather whatever information they could, and leave undetected. But even with their careful planning, they could feel the eyes of their enemies upon them. The villa was far from ordinary. It was a hub for secret meetings, a place where the powerful and the corrupt gathered to negotiate deals that no one was supposed to know about. Inside, Isabel's eyes darted across the room, taking in the opulence that surrounded her fine art, rare antiques, chandeliers made of crystal. But the beauty of the surroundings was overshadowed by the sense of danger. Every person in that room had a hidden agenda, and Isabel knew they were not safe for long. As they moved deeper into the villa, a voice broke through the silence. It was familiar, too familiar. Isabel turned, her heart racing, as Maria Garcia appeared from the shadows. She was even more imposing in person, her sharp eyes scanning the room with the calculating gaze of someone who had mastered the art of control. "You shouldn't have come here," Maria said, her voice cold and direct. "You have no idea what you're up against." Before Isabel could respond, two men appeared from behind Maria, their faces masked. In an instant, Isabel and Marco were surrounded. The realization hit Isabel like a punch to the gut. They had walked right into a trap. Maria's smile was almost pitying as she stepped closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. "You think you can expose me, but you are nothing. You are just two people against a network that spans continents. You cannot win." The weight of her words hung in the air, a bitter reminder of the power that protected people like Maria Garcia. Isabel had spent months gathering evidence, and now it seemed like all their efforts were about to be crushed by the very people who had caused so much suffering. But Isabel refused to back down. The truth was within reach, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. With a sharp breath, she looked directly at Maria and said, "We know about the children. We know what you've been doing, and we're not stopping until it's exposed." At that moment, Marco made a quick move, knocking one of the masked men off balance. The sound of a struggle echoed through the villa. In the chaos, Isabel grabbed a piece of artwork from the wall, something heavy, and swung it toward one of the other attackers, knocking him to the ground. The confusion lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to break their captors' concentrations. Isabel and Marco made a run for it, pushing through the villa's back exit and sprinting toward the streets. As they ran, their breaths labored and hearts pounding. Isabel couldn't help but wonder if they had truly escaped. The danger was closing in, and even if they survived the night, they had no guarantee of making it out alive. But they had to keep going. For Lucas, for the children still trapped in the shadows. The stakes had never been higher. The night air was thick with the scent of salt water and smoke as Isabel and Marco raced down the narrow streets of the French Riviera, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They had narrowly escaped the villa, but the reality of what had just transpired was beginning to sink in. They had gone up against one of the most dangerous people they had encountered in their search for Lucas, and yet they had barely made it out alive. But the deeper they got, the more they realized that Maria Garcia was just the tip of the iceberg. They didn't stop running until they were far from the villa, finding shelter in a small, nondescript apartment in a nearby town. It was here, in the quiet, dimly lit room, that Isabel felt the weight of everything crashing down on her. She had always thought of Lucas as her brother, someone she could protect, but now everything had shifted. He was no longer just a missing child. He was part of a larger system, a part of an operation so vast and so deeply ingrained in the fabric of society that exposing it seemed like an impossible task. Marco, too, was shaken. Despite his years in the force, he had never encountered anything like this network of corruption and trafficking, operating with the protection of the powerful. They had uncovered more than they could have imagined, but the closer they got, the more dangerous things became. Every lead they followed seemed to draw them deeper into a web of deceit and betrayal. It wasn't until the next day that Isabel received the phone call that would change everything. She had been waiting anxiously in the apartment when the ring of the phone startled her. She answered, her hand shaking. "It's me," a familiar voice said. It was her uncle, Manuel Alvarez, the man who had raised her after her parents' deaths. "Isabel, we need to talk." Her heart dropped. Manuel had always been a figure of stability in her life. He was a well-known politician, highly respected in their community. He had been her pillar of support, the person who guided her after the loss of her mother. But now, something in his voice sounded off. There was a coldness there, something she couldn't quite place. "What is it?" Uncle Isabel asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "I know what you've been doing," Manuel said. "I know about the investigation, about Lucas." Isabel felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had no idea how much her uncle knew, or how he had found out. But she did know one thing: this was not a coincidence. "You've been digging too deep, Isabel," Manuel continued, his voice tight. "There are things you don't understand, things you're better off not knowing." "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Isabel demanded. "Why didn't you tell me what happened to Lucas?" A long pause filled the air, and when Manuel spoke again, his words were like a slap to her face. "I was protecting you," he said, his voice low. "You have no idea who you're up against. The people involved in this, they don't just hurt children, they have no limits." Isabel's mind raced. Was her uncle trying to warn her, or was he part of the system they were trying to bring down? The more she thought about it, the more everything began to make sense in a terrifying way. Her uncle, a powerful politician, had the means to protect himself. He had always been in the right circles, surrounded by influential people. But now, Isabel was beginning to understand that his influence wasn't just a result of hard work and integrity, it was tied to something far darker. "You're a part of it, aren't you?" Isabel said, her voice barely a whisper. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her uncle had been involved all along. He had been one of the people facilitating the trafficking network, using his power to keep it hidden, to shield the perpetrators from justice. Her uncle's response was chillingly calm. "I did what I had to do to survive, Isabel, and now you have a choice. You can stop this investigation, or you can walk away, and I'll make sure nothing happens to you. But if you keep pushing, I can't protect you anymore." The line went dead. Isabel stood in stunned silence, the phone still pressed to her ear. The man she had trusted most in the world, the one who had always been there for her, was part of the very network she was fighting against. Her blood ran cold as she realized just how deep the corruption went. There were no safe spaces left, no allies, just a tangled web of lies and betrayal. Marco, sensing Isabel's shock, walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We can't let him stop us. We've come this far, and we're not backing down now." Isabel nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve, but her heart was heavy with the weight of the betrayal. She had never imagined that the people closest to her would be the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes. But now, with her uncle's words ringing in her ears, she knew they had no choice but to move forward, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, Isabel and Marco continued to press on with the investigation. They uncovered more documents, more names, more evidence that pointed to a vast network of trafficking that stretched across Europe, the United States, and beyond. But even as they made strides in their search for the truth, the shadow of her uncle's betrayal loomed over them. The deeper they dug, the more they realized that this wasn't just about Lucas. It was about bringing down an entire system, a system that had been built on the suffering of countless children. But the cost was higher than either of them had anticipated, and they were quickly learning that no one, not even the people they had trusted most, could be counted on. The truth had never been so elusive, yet so close. After the phone call from her uncle, Isabel had felt a rush of anger and betrayal flood her veins. The man who had raised her, who had been a beacon of safety in her life, was now revealed to be part of the very system she was desperately trying to expose. It was a painful realization, but it was also a turning point. Isabel knew now that there could be no half measures. There could be no turning back. The game had changed. Isabel and Marco didn't waste any time. They knew the stakes were higher than ever, and they were now more determined than ever to bring the truth to light. The threats from her uncle rang in her ears, but they did little to deter her. If anything, they fueled her desire for justice. Lucas, the other children, and the countless victims of this trafficking network needed her to keep going. There was no room for fear or hesitations. They tracked down more information about the high-profile people who had been involved in the trafficking ring. The names they had uncovered were staggering business moguls, politicians, and celebrities. The very people who controlled the levers of power were behind the operation. And these were not just small-time criminals. They were people with the means to cover their tracks, to make the truth disappear. But Isabel and Marco had something they didn't: courage and determination. The final confrontation took place in an unexpected place, a luxurious estate in the French countryside, owned by one of the most influential men in Europe, whose name had appeared repeatedly in the documents they'd uncovered. This man, known only as Vincent Duval, was rumored to be the ringleader of the trafficking network. His connections stretched far and wide, and his wealth and influence made him untouchable by the law. But Isabel was determined to expose him for what he was. The estate was a sprawling mansion, nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside. It seemed peaceful, serene even, but beneath the surface, it was a fortress. Security guards were everywhere, and the mansion's pristine grounds were dotted with hidden cameras. But Isabel and Marco had come prepared. They knew the risks, and they knew the price of failure. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had no choice. This was the moment they had been working toward. Their plan was simple: infiltrate the estate, gather any evidence they could find, and expose Duval's operations to the world. It was a dangerous mission, but Isabel couldn't back down. The thought of Lucas, still lost in the darkness of this network, drove her forward. Every step they took was a step closer to bringing the truth to light. They entered the estate under the cover of darkness, blending into the shadows. The air was thick with tension as they moved silently across the grounds, slipping past security checkpoints, avoiding the watchful eyes of the guards. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, each movement calculated, each sound amplified in the quiet night. The grand halls of the mansion were eerily empty, but they could feel the weight of its secrets pressing down on them. Inside the mansion, they found what they were looking for: a hidden room, filled with files and documents that revealed the full scope of Duval's operations. The walls were lined with photographs, pictures of children, of families, of transactions. These were the kinds of pictures that should have never been taken, the kinds of pictures that would forever haunt anyone who saw them. And yet, these were the pictures that had been used to facilitate the most grotesque of crimes. But just as Isabel was about to retrieve the documents, the door behind them slammed shut. They were trapped. The lights flickered on, and the shadowy figures of Duval's men filled the doorway, their faces expressionless, their eyes cold. Vincent Duval appeared from the darkness, his footsteps echoing as he approached them. He was calm, composed, and his smile was one of someone who knew they were in control. "I must admit, I'm impressed," Duval said, his voice smooth. "I didn't think anyone would get this far. But now, you've made a grave mistake." Marco moved instinctively, pulling Isabel behind him as the men closed in. It was a standoff. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Isabel's pulse raced, but she stood tall, refusing to back down. "You're not going to get away with this," Isabel said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "We have everything we need to bring you down." Duval chuckled, a cold, mirthless laugh. "You think you can stop me? You think you can expose me? There are more powerful people behind me than you'll ever know. You'll never make it out of here alive." Isabel's heart raced as Duval's men circled around them, weapons drawn. This was it. There was no escape, no room for second chances. They had come too far to let it end here. But Isabel knew the odds were slim. If they were going to survive, they needed to think quickly. Suddenly, Marco lunged toward one of the guards, knocking the weapon from his hands. The room erupted into chaos. The sharp crack of gunfire rang out, but Isabel and Marco managed to duck behind a table, narrowly avoiding the bullets. The confrontation quickly escalated into a full-blown fight for survival. The noise, the flashing lights, and the chaos were deafening, but Isabel couldn't focus on anything other than the missions. In the midst of the chaos, Isabel spotted a small door leading to the back of the mansion. Without thinking, she grabbed Marco's arm and pulled him toward it. They ran, their footsteps pounding against the cold stone floors. The guards were right behind them, but they couldn't stop now. They had to make it out alive. They had to finish what they started. As they burst through the back door and into the night, the sound of pursuit grew fainter. They had escaped, but they knew the fight was far from over. Duval's network was vast, and his reach extended beyond what they had initially realized. But they had the evidence, they had the truth, and no matter what happened next, they knew they had done the right thing. They had exposed the darkness. The night that followed the escape from Vincent Duval's estate was one of the quiet reflection, overshadowed by the heavy weight of everything they had uncovered. Isabel and Marco had barely managed to slip away, their lives hanging by a thread. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but they had done what they came to do. The files they had gathered, documents detailing Duval's trafficking ring, and the names of the people who had participated in it were now in their possession. The truth had been laid bare. But even with the evidence in hand, Isabel knew the battle was far from over. The revelations they had uncovered were just the beginning. Duval's network was vast, and its reach extended far beyond anything they could have imagined. As they drove away from the estate, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that their escape had only temporarily delayed the inevitable. The people who were part of this operation would stop at nothing to protect themselves, and Isabel and Marco knew that they were now targets. The next few days were spent in hiding. As Isabel and Marco planned their next steps, they knew they had to get the evidence to the authorities, but they couldn't trust anyone just yet. Not after what had happened with Isabel's uncle. The betrayal still stung. She had believed in him, trusted him, and now she knew that he was part of the very system they were fighting against. His words echoed in her mind. There are things you don't understand, things you're better off not knowing. But she wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. She had come too far. Lucas and the other children who had been taken deserved justice. It wasn't just about exposing Duval anymore. It was about dismantling an entire system of exploitation that had been operating in the shadows for far too long. Isabel and Marco decided to take the evidence to a trusted journalist, someone with the influence and resources to make sure the story got the attention it deserved. They knew it was a risky move, but it was the only way to ensure the truth reached the public. They couldn't rely on the authorities. They had to go above their heads. In the weeks that followed, the world began to learn the truth. The story broke, spreading like wildfire through the media. Investigative reports revealed the shocking extent of the child trafficking network that had been running for decades. The names of the powerful individuals involved were exposed, and the public outrage was overwhelming. For the first time in years, the truth had a chance to see the light of day. But even as the network began to crumble, Isabel and Marco knew there would be no easy resolution. Many of the people involved in the trafficking operation had already fled, disappearing into the shadows once more. Duval, the mastermind behind the operation, was still at large, and Isabel knew that he wouldn't go down without a fight. As for Lucas, the search for him continued. The public attention brought renewed efforts to find the missing children. But Isabel's heart ached as she realized that the answers she had been hoping for may never come. Lucas had been taken years ago, and the trail had grown colder with time, but she couldn't give up on him. She couldn't give up on any of the children who had been stolen from their families. They all deserved to be found, to be brought home. One day, as Isabel sat in a quiet cafe, a small envelope arrived in the mail. It was unmarked, with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a photograph of Lucas, older now, standing next to a familiar face. The woman in the photo was Maria Garcia, her cold eyes staring directly into the camera. The photo was taken in a place Isabel didn't recognize, but it was a sign proof that Lucas was still out there, that he had not been forgotten. Isabel's heart pounded as she studied the image. It was a small lead, but it was something. It was a glimmer of hope in the midst of the darkness. The search wasn't over. The fight for justice wasn't over. But as Isabel stared at the photograph, she couldn't help but wonder how many others were still out there, lost in the shadows, waiting to be found. How many more families were living in the agony of uncertainty, just like hers? The truth had been exposed, but there were still so many unanswered questions. The trafficking network had been disrupted, but it wasn't destroyed. The powerful people behind it were still out there, hiding in plain sight. And Isabel knew, deep down, that her journey was far from finished. She wasn't just fighting for Lucas anymore. She was fighting for every child, every family that had been torn apart by the cruelty of the world she had uncovered. There would be no easy victories, no simple conclusions. But Isabel had made a promise to herself and to her brother that she would never stop fighting. The truth had been exposed, But the fight for justice was only just beginning. As the sun set over the horizon, Isabel felt a sense of quiet determination. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready. She had already come so far. She wasn't going to stop now. So